Stacy, hi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to having our little chat.
I am super excited to chat to you because you are an absolute hero in the world of fitness and such an amazing font of knowledge. So I have so many questions that I'd love to ask you. So I'm going to jump straight in with this. And I want to know the biggest misconceptions that you feel are in the female fitness industry. I realize it's a broad question, but what springs to mind?
I think the biggest thing is that we just assume that all the stuff that we've been told about training and nutrition is for us and works for us. And when we look from the high touch, we know that that's not true. So I think the biggest misconception really feeds into diet trends, fitness trends, weight training, zone two, all of these kinds of things that no one really questions. Like, is this really appropriate for me and my body? Or, they have their partner or their coach or someone who's doing it from a male perspective. And it's like, yeah, it's great.
I think that that's something that really stuck out to me when I read your book Roar. It sounds so obvious when you actually lay it out, but I don't feel like anyone else is talking about it. We're not just small men. Like women are completely different in their whole physiology and the training that we respond to in our bodies. And of course, monthly cycles, the amount of fat that we carry naturally. Like it's so obvious when you point it out. Yet no one else is talking about it. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, this makes sense to me. So can you just talk about that process of figuring that out and actually publicizing it with the information that women need to understand their bodies?
My mom will tell you I was always the kid that asked why. So it's kind of been intrinsic for me to ask why. And my TED Talk kind of covers when I was at university, and I was always the participant in the metabolism labs, and it was me and two other guys that were the usual participants. And a lot of things, my results were not what the instructor thought they should be. So I was accused, well, not accused, but told I didn't standardize right, or I did something wrong, or, there's always these little things that it was my fault. And that really annoyed me because I came from a military family and I know how to follow rules. And so I was like, wait, no, this isn't right. I'm doing these things that I'm supposed to be doing, but yet the results are wrong. So how can I be wrong? It must be either the equipment. So we'd go back and forth about all of this. And then finally, I said, well, you know what? It could be just because you're a girl. And I was like, what? What does that have to do with this? And they're like, well, a lot of times we just include women's results when they match the men's. Otherwise, we throw them out because it's an anomaly. And I was like, wait a second. So then I started really looking at the context, and there was no representation of women in any of the textbooks, any of the images. There was no real representation of women. And then being a collegiate athlete and really trying to do my best and work with my teammates, and we're having fail points. And, as women, we talk about that time of the month and things that guys didn't talk about. So I was like, wait, there really is a sticky point here. Like, I don't understand why we're not being represented in any of the research, but yet we're being told what's good for our bodies. So that was kind of a seed that had been planted. And then going through, you go to any kind of shop and you see men's department, women's department, perfume for women, perfume for men. You have nutrition bars that are for women, nutrition bars for men. There's all these gendered things, but when it comes to the basic physiological aspect that really does say, yeah, XXXY, we know there's a difference. No one looked at it. No one talked about it. So it was like, there's a sticky point here and this isn't right. So that was kind of like the jumping point for really trying to go after it as an athlete and an academic.
Think that it's a two-pronged approach really, because not only were you interested from a scientific point of view and trying to understand it more from research point of view, there wasn't actually anything out there, any studies out there, but also from a personal athlete's point of view. So you realize this, which kind of helps us all to understand, okay, it's okay that we're not getting the same results as men, we are different. But then suddenly you realize there's no research on this. It's quite an overwhelming discovery that in fact half of the human race don't actually have any of this research that is applied to them. So how did you then combat that and channel this curiosity into the amazing career that you have built for yourself?
I think there wasn't a plan. It was just a do. So, I mean, like throughout all of the opportunities I've had the opportunity to work for an obesity surgeon. Most of the clients were women, but the outcomes were not as good for the women as they were for men. The prescription medicines for the patients were the same, even though, you know, you have women that's weight and body composition is different than the men's. So there were a whole bunch of little things early on where I was like, we really have to figure this out. And so going back to lab, answering questions that I wanted to answer for myself, for my teammates, for other people that were asking these questions. So it was just kind of a built upon and a built upon because I had the opportunity working in a clinical environment, being an athlete, then translating into human performance research to be able to answer the questions that were coming, and also reaching outside of sports science because sports science is so male dominated. You have to look outside. And so I started looking at things like the fertility research and endocrine research and seeing that there were actually sex difference studies done. And so you could kind of understand what was going on, but just trying to bring it into the sports science world has been a battle and still is a little bit of a battle, but we're getting better.
But I think it's a bit of an enigma, isn't it? How do you actually form the perfect exercise routine? What is sustainable? What is actually good for you? Women might say, I want to lose weight, therefore I'm going to immediately do cardio. That is their go-to thing. Like probably rather than looking at their diet even. Do you know, they might look at their diet, but they might also say, right, I need to do cardio. I need to go out running is probably the most accessible one that they go to. But a lot of people don't actually like running. And often cardio isn't just the answer. And this is another amazing piece of work that you've done on the discovery of the weight training aspect on that. So can you give me a bit of information talking me through that and why it's important as well?
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the cardio and women always defaulting to cardio, I'm like, that's a sociocultural metric, right? Because when you're looking at the research, it still is, yes, cardiovascular work will burn more calories, but that doesn't transfer into weight loss. We have to look at intensity, we have to look at building metabolic tissue. But the prevailing idea out there stemming from like the 80s and 90s of the Jane Fonda and the supermodel era of calories in, calories out, fat burning, it was all geared towards women. And we even see that now when we go to big gym chains where a woman will come in and say, yeah, I want to join the gym. I've been hesitant. And the person that's taking her through is like, well, here's all the cardio stuff. How much weight do you want to lose? But if a man were to come in and he's like, yeah, I've been really hesitant, the person taking him around will be like, okay, bro, you know, you want to build more muscle mass. Here's the lifting platform. So it's just very culturally endemic that women assume that we need to go for a run to lose weight. But when we look from a metabolic and a scientific perspective, it's strength training. We
Mm-hmm.
look at building lean mass because it's more metabolically active. If we have more skeletal muscle, then there's more what we call myokines or exerkines. So these are little signals that come out when we exercise to say, you know what, we don't need visceral fat, but we do need to store a little bit more fat in and around the skeletal muscle, not from a sarcopenic perspective, but for a fueling perspective. So when we're looking at what do we actually need to do to lose weight, and it's not about weight loss per se, it's about body composition change. So we know that short, sharp, high intensity work, regardless of how old you are, in strength training are really essential for moderating and changing body composition.
Because strength training is so important, but then I feel like a lot of people as they get older they get worried about, you know, hurting their back or they've got aches and pains and that sort of thing, so they're like, I'm not going to go and lift heavy weights, like that'll absolutely ruin me. But then you have this kind of cycle that it's so important for the longevity of your limbs, the longevity of your muscles, to have that strength, to have your core so you can stand up. And there's an amazing kind of montage of video going about, you know, I lift these weights so that I can stand out of a chair when I'm older, or I can walk up the
Yeah.
stairs, I can lift the shopping. It's not just so you're going to go and become, you know, Miss Universe in a beauty contest of weightlifting. It's so that you can actually have the independence throughout your life. But if someone's perhaps carrying a little bit more weight and they think, okay, I understand this weight training thing, but is it actually going to show any results, or do I need to pair cardio with that? How can people have that weight loss journey? What would your recommendations be?
So I always look at it from more of a three-prong approach where we look at what are the quote big rocks. So if they're on a weight loss journey, we really have to look at sleep and we have to dial in sleep, because you're not going to get any kind of metabolic change or control if your sleep is not good. So look at sleep hygiene, the quality of the sleep, and work on that. And then the first thing that we do is we phase people into understanding resistance training. So it's not like I'm going to take someone who's never been in the gym before and say, okay, today we're going to do 100-kilo deadlifts. I'm going to see how they move. I'm going to see how comfortable they are, what they feel about resistance training. Do they have a myth that, I'm going to get bulky if I lift heavy weights? So really trying to unpack where the person's coming from. And then we phase them in through movement training, how they move, where their sticky points are, technique. Are they comfortable with dumbbells or kettlebells? So we start them in an area of comfort and understanding rather than throwing them in the deep end, because it's not a training block. A lot of people think, oh, I'm going to do 12 weeks of resistance training and I'm going to have really good body composition. We're not looking at it that way. We're looking at, okay, what are we doing now so that when we're 60, we can still move really well and have good body composition, same as when we're 80 and above. So we start the journey now, and weight is going to change, but slowly. It takes time to put the weight on. So it's going to take time to change that body composition and get the weight off. So we start them that way. So when we have the sleep and the resistance training down, then we'll start to look to add some high intensity interval work. So this could be sprint intervals where people are just starting to learn how to go really, really hard for 30 seconds or less. And it's a very short, sharp session, maybe 10 minutes total. Or we teach them or bring them into a true high intensity interval training class or session. And we don't do very many of them because those are hard and uncomfortable. And so until someone learns what it means to go hard and be a little bit uncomfortable and be okay with that, we don't want to put any kind of negative spin on it. But along the ways as we're going, people's nutritional approach changes, because as they're starting to feel better and as their gut microbiome is changing based on the different exercises that they're doing, they start to change their nutrition intake to feel better to match what they're doing. So then the very last prong approach of the three, so we have sleep, we have the different exercises and how we phase those in. So then we look at the nutrition. And it's understanding that everyone has kind of a cultish idea about nutrition. Instead of saying, I am following a paleo diet, they're like, I'm paleo, or I'm keto, or I'm IF. So we know that it's very much a cultural thing. So we look at, okay, how are we going to change the nutrition throughout the day to match the stress points? So try to bring it into more what we call a chronobiological aspect, where we're working with our circadian rhythm. Because we know from the research in the chronobiology that if we're eating throughout the day and we're starting to taper off in the afternoon, evening, we get better sleep, which then feeds forward to all the things that we want. So it's that big three kind of big rock approach that does take time. But then we're trying to teach people how to listen to their body, how to change it, instead of coming in and saying, yeah, I need a personal trainer to thrash me for 12 weeks. Because I think that's the other misconception, is people think that every session has to make them feel smashed. And that's not what it's about. You can get really fantastic results by being very specific in the periodization of your resistance training. And yes, it's hard, but you don't feel smashed. If you do, then we need to see how are we going to mix it up a little bit, because that's not the goal. The goal is a weight loss journey to feel better, to be healthier, and to enjoy the new behaviors that you're bringing into your life.
I love how you kind of say, the interval training, it's really hard and you need to get used to that feeling, because it doesn't feel good at the time, because your body's sending these signals of, we can't keep this up. We can't keep this up. Like biologically, it is sending those signals. It's amazing when you actually analyze that our bodies do respond in that way. But I think perhaps from an athletic point of view, the first few weeks of training, you're just training how to train. Like you aren't actually
Exactly.
training for results. You're training to know what to do when you walk into the gym, how you're supposed to feel, how you're supposed to recover. And actually, it's not about the results then. You're just training your mind as much as your body at the start.
Exactly. And I tell women, women expect to be able to do a power-based resistance training session pretty soon after they start training, because they understand how to train, how to move. But I'm like, you know what, to really do a proper 3x3 heavy lift, it could take a year or more. of getting that training pattern and understanding how to load in order to do those safely and effectively. So again, it's part of that journey, right? Because it is learning to train and how to feel what that feels like. And you're developing new motor patterns, neural pathways. You're getting different changes in your weight, and that can change your biomechanic in a sense of center of gravity and the way that you're moving. So it is definitely an evolution, but it's a really fascinating evolution.
Big barrier for people is actually how long it takes. You say there, it could take you a year to actually set up that workout. And people think, but that's so long. Like that's going to take me far too long. So they look for shortcuts. And one of the big controversial shortcuts at the moment is the Ozempic drug for weight
Mm-hmm.
loss, which has skyrocketed and had an amazing results. But people don't really know what the lasting effects are on it. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and I also get asked about his impact a lot. And when we're looking at it, it's a tool in a toolbox, but unfortunately, it's not being pushed that way because, like, the pharmaceutical companies are making a lot of money on it, and they want to say, you need to be on this forever. But if we look at what's actually happening, the very first tissue to go in a severe weight loss is lean mass. And the hardest thing to build is lean mass. So I'm now saying, do you remember the movie Wall-E from like 2000, 2002, where they had the guys floating and the screen in front and the guy falls off and he can't stand up because he hasn't been standing in years? I was like, that's the Ozempic Society. Unless we actually tell them this is a tool in the toolbox to weight loss and healthier lifestyle, but you also have to do resistance training. You have to do some cardiovascular work, either high intensity or your zone 2, whatever it is, because we are very concerned about the lean mass in the bone. Because if we are doing that really fast, rapid weight loss, we're losing the integrity of our muscle or muscle tissue, not only total muscle tissue, but also the pull on the bone. So we're losing bone strength and bone density. We're setting our society up to be a very sick society unless we are also giving the tools to be able to build a healthy life to then get off Ozempic.
But it's quite a new concept that people are talking about. It's not a new concept, but people are talking about it more as the bone density. But when you're older, if you don't have that impact that you've created, that your limbs can take it, can you just kind of talk me through why it's important for women, especially, to be aware of bone density?
Yeah, so it's not just the skeletal system itself, like the bones that make up our body. It's the matrix of the bone, because you can think about a bamboo straw that's really hard and it's hard to break. Or you can think about a flexi straw. Both might be hollow, but if we're thinking about the matrix of the bamboo straw that's really hard to break, then that's kind of the eye that we have for people who are aging, who've had low bone mineral density. But unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of people who have more like the flexi straw, where it's really easy to break and bend. And if we don't have an impact from jumping or multi-directional stress, then we're not challenging the bone. So we're not going to build the outer aspect of the bone to be like a bamboo straw, nor are we going to be able to fill it with the matrix needed for things like our red cells and other aspects that are in the bone marrow and the actual cellular matrix of the bone itself. So we think about the endocrine function of bone. That's really important as well. So it's not just the strength and the integrity to hold our system up, but it's also all the things that the bone as an active tissue help with the longevity and health of our bodies.
And is that mostly from weight training and exercise itself, or does diet feed into that? And, calcium, like drink your milk so you have strong bones. Is that an urban myth, or does it actually have value?
Oh, we need vitamin D, calcium, and women estrogen. So we know that women lose around 1/3 of their bone mass in the menopause transition because estrogen, progesterone has such a tight hold on how our bones remodel. So when we're looking at losing that, then we want to be able to do some impact, but it's not like running or walking. It's not enough. We need to do resistance training, yes, for sure, because we're getting a different load on the bone, multi-directional stress, but jump impact. So there have been a few women who've worked with one of my friends who's a specialist in bone. And she's had them do heavy resistance training plus 10 minutes of just impact jumping 3 times a week. And the women that have come in to see her have been osteopenic. So they're, really low bone, not completely osteoporotic. And over the course of 6 to 7 months, they've gone from the very middle of being osteopenic to having the low end of normal bone density through resistance training and jumping. So it's very, very possible to build bone when you are older if you're putting the right kind of stress on the bone. So I think that's the other misconception, that when you lose it, you've lost it. But that's not true. It's like we know that peak bone mass comes and then we start to lose it when we're hitting around our 30s with our muscle as well. But if we are putting an external stress on the body through exercise and, of course, good nutrition, the body responds in kind because it's very adaptable. So we just need to make sure that we're putting the right kind of stressors on to build that bone as well as the muscle that goes with it.
That's incredible that it is actually reversible, that people can bring it back if you are in that situation. And I think a lot of exercise is sustainability as well, that you can bring things back and you can build things, whether it's strength or nutrition. And another topic I would really love to talk to you about is fasting. People who think, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go for my morning run, or I'm going to go to the gym, I'm not going to have breakfast because then I'm going to be burning my calories and I'm going to lose my weight quicker because I'm not going to be burning off my breakfast, basically. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I get this question all the time. And I mean, I'm notorious for bashing fasting. When we look at it, I'm a physiologist, so I look at brain signaling and how we have areas of appetite control, endocrine control, and part of that also is thyroid, as well as how our body responds to fueling. So if someone is going to get up and do a workout session, someone being female, because men, completely different story here. If we're thinking about women getting up and doing a training session fasted, I pretty much say, well, why did you do that? You should have just stayed in bed. That would have been better for your body composition. Because when we're looking at fasting and we're trying to hit intensities, we know that a half an hour after you wake up, you have a peak in cortisol. And exercise also increases cortisol because just like your heart rate goes up, cortisol goes up. And when you have that elevation of cortisol, your brain's getting a lot of signals of, okay, I need to break things down. So you're breaking down primarily lean mass and fat and a little bit of carbohydrate to fuel. But the signaling goes further than that because you're trying to do an exercise stress or really strong external stress on the body without nutrition. And the brain's like, hey, where's the nutrition? Where is the nutrition density? And in women's brains, we have a higher density of what we call kisspeptin and kisspeptin neurons. And they're very sensitive to calorie intake and as well as stress. So it controls our endocrine system. It controls our appetite hormones. So if we go into exercise fasted, we start to have this dysregulation of our endocrine system. So we know 4 days of fasted workouts, we start to have a drop in our thyroid function. And it feeds forward to a dysregulation of our daily hormone pulses, which is really important for endocrine function. We know from the research that if women have just a little bit of protein and carbohydrate before their training, then they actually end up with better outcomes of the exercise. So they're able to hit higher stress loads. But post-exercise, they have a greater increase in what we call the EPOC, or your excessive post-oxygen consumption. In general layperson terms, that's elevated metabolism, which people are like, I want my metabolism to be up. But also by having food afterwards as well, we're telling the hypothalamus, yep, we can drop cortisol, we can start building that lean mass, and we can use more body fat as a resting fuel. When we see it in men, it's a different story. And that has to do with differences in muscle morphology. They have more glycolytic fibers, less oxidative. They also have a lower threshold that they're able to sustain with lower calorie intake. So when we see fasted data, it works well because it does really work well in men. But when we translate it and see what's happening in women, it's a completely different story.
When you say, okay, if you eat before and you eat after, probably quite a lot of women, there'll be alarm bells going off in their mind thinking, I cannot possibly do that. I'm trying to lose weight. What is the point of even working out then? But when you say eat beforehand, is it a significant breakfast, or does it literally, could it just be like a banana?
It could be just a banana. It doesn't have to be a significant amount of food. We look at some of the work that Abby Smith Ryan's done at University of North Carolina, and it ends up being 30 grams of carbohydrate, which is really tiny amount, and 10 to 15 grams of protein. So it could be a banana with some nut butter. It could be protein fortified coffee. It doesn't have to be a lot. Post exercise, you want to get a good hit of protein in. But again, you could have your breakfast there or split your breakfast if you're not that hungry. And the other thing that people forget, you're not losing weight during exercise, you're creating the stress. So you want to be able to create as much stress for an adaptive response that you can during exercise. And if you're not fueling for it, then you're not hitting the intensities and you're not maximizing the type of stress you can put on your body. So it actually slows the rate of weight loss down and slows the rate of adaptation down. What we want to think about is I want to fuel for the stress at hand. And then in the evening, I'm going to take away maybe 150 to 200 calories as my calorie deficit. And this works so much better with our chronobiology, but also for that brain signaling to be able to drop body fat, drop visceral fat, increase lean mass, and to get the benefits of exercise that we all talk about.
And are you in favor of calorie counting as a personal level? No.
Not at
Interesting.
all. I know. Because there's a big debate of calories in, calories out, but it's a misconception of an algorithm because the types of calories that are coming in is more important when we talk about nutrient density. And yes, people say, well, it's an energetic question, right? So if you need 3,000 calories to exist and you take in 2,500, then that's a 500 calorie deficit. Of course, you're going to lose weight. If you're a man, sure, we can look at it that way. But when we look at women, because there's different thresholds for signaling and maintaining our weight or losing weight and metabolic thresholds, it doesn't work the same. So we have to look at how we are fueling for the stress during the day. That's exercise stress. That's the allosteric load of, what life stress is. Because if we start working with our circadian rhythm and fueling when we need to, then we keep our endocrine system in check. And so that means that we have better thyroid function. We have better responses to overall stress. And our body isn't in that tired but wired sympathetic driven state, so that we can actually have this polarization of our autonomic nervous system, which then allows the body to get more into a relaxed state at times when it needs to, but also really turn on when it needs to. And this overall helps with that weight loss.
Because it's so complex. When you talk about weight loss, it's not just, as you say, calories in, calories out. It's very different for women. And, I love, even going back to our earlier topic, was sleep. Just first thing to sort is sleep. And that's something that people would kind of think is like stage 4. Like, firstly, I need to sort my exercise, my movement, even stress, I feel would come before sleep. And, my food, what nutrition I'm having, and then they'd think of sleep. It's kind of crazy to think the vastness of that. And another thing that you mentioned was how we should taper our food off kind of towards the end of the day to then link into getting a good night's sleep. But I would say traditionally, at least in the UK, certainly, we generally would have our big meal, our dinner, in the evening. Last thing, people have at different times, but generally like an hour, or few hours before we go to bed. Should we change that?
If we are not having food 2 to 3 hours before bed, that's fine. But what happens is people end up bookending their days with calories. So they're like, yeah, I'm going to be on breakfast. I heard this podcast and I got to have breakfast. And then they go through the day with not much food. And their body gets into a catabolic or breakdown state, and then they get home and they're starving. So then they have a lot of calories at night. That's the same as not eating for the most part until the end of the day because of the brain signaling and how it's perturbing our circadian rhythm. And I talk about circadian rhythm because women's is a little bit longer than men's. So we have more difficulty with different phase shifts like night shift, jet lag, even social jet lag, staying up late on a Friday and that kind of stuff. And when we have that disruption and sleep is a part of that, then we have greater inflammation and greater cellular inflammation. We have more metabolically active adipose tissue. So all of these things lead forward to more insulin resistance, a dysregulation of our glucose control, which is a whole range of reasons why women can't lose weight as easily as men. So if we start looking at, okay, let's back our food up and make sure that we have at least 2 to 3 hours before we go to bed, that's a really good start. So, like tonight, my daughter had soccer practice and she didn't get home till 8 o'clock. And I'm not eating dinner that late. So my husband and my daughter are, but I had dinner about 6:30. And I feel bad for not being part of the family dinner, but I'm like, if I wait until then to eat dinner with her, then I'm going to go to bed really full and I'm going to have a shit sleep. So it's
Mm.
things that I've learned across both my work and other people's and implementing it. And my husband has this whole thing. He's like, I want to have dinner with her, but I also don't want to eat that late. I'm like, well, we should feed her dinner before she goes to soccer, which would be the good thing. But that doesn't happen either. Can't get organized enough yet.
But then also a huge part of women specifically not feeling fueled is because they don't have enough protein. And I think that when you say protein, people think of, the big weightlifters and the big, it's very like the dark, like protein shakes that are very manly and things like that. But it's actually
Mm-hmm.
not just that. And in fact, you can have so much protein sources without buying specific protein powder, which again, I think that there's a misunderstanding of what actually exists in our food, unprocessed food as well. What are your favorite protein sources?
I head up one of the groups that we have for some of our strength training programs we have, and they're always asking me, like, how do I get enough protein in? So I've put a few schematics in where it ends up being 140 to 150 grams of protein. And people are like, whoa, that's just normal food. I was like, yeah, there's no protein powder in there. So we start like with oatmeal and chia seeds soaked overnight, and then you put in some nuts and some Greek yogurt, low fat Greek yogurt and some berries. So that's breakfast. And then some almonds and some hummus can be a snack. And then you have lunch that is edamame and other beans and maybe some chicken if you want that. Sprouted grain bread as a sandwich and a salad. And then you get to afternoon snack. It's kind of similar to, you're having hummus and carrots, or you're having nuts and some cheese, or maybe you're having some hard boiled eggs. And then dinner is a mix of like lentils and sweet potatoes, quinoa, some pumpkin seeds. And so it's a vegan bowl. But over the course of the day, you end up with around 140 to 150 grams of protein. And women have this misconception that that's too much protein. It's like, well, actually, when we look at it, people forget that the recommended daily allowance for protein is the bare minimum to prevent malnutrition. And when you are active and you're trying to keep and build lean mass, you need more than that. So we know that women on average, if they're just recreationally active and they're premenopausal, so in your reproductive years, you need minimum of 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo per day. And when we start looking at getting older, because we become more resistant to building muscle through exercise and food, that ekes up to about 2 to 2.3 grams per kilo per day. And when you start doing the math, women freak out because, again, yeah, we have that social construct that we have to, eat lots of meat and have protein shakes and do all the bodybuilding stuff. When actually, no, we just look at all the different types of protein that's on all the different foods that we eat. And we end up with a really good level of good quality protein throughout the day.
And what about processed sugar? Because that all sounds incredible, like that diet. I think if people said, okay, well, if I was presented with this diet every day, that's great. But sometimes I just want to buy a chocolate bar on the go, get that sugar hit. And I think in our culture, it's so ingrained that we don't even know what has got processed sugar in it. Like a lot of the things that we just consume without even thinking about it.
Yeah. And I mean, we have that part of life, right? So I tell people follow the 80-20 rule. So if 80% of the time you're pretty much aware that you're having non-processed or at least not ultra processed food, and you can manage what you're eating throughout the day, reaching for colorful fruits and veg, all the things that I as an expert say to do, but then me as Stacy Sims has that 20% of life where I'm like, I really like dark chocolate and I love a good whiskey. And yeah, I have too many coffees in a day. And so we shouldn't feel bad about that, right? So that 20% is the life factor where you're like, I want that dark chocolate bar. Don't hold off, like get it. Because if you hold off, then you're going to really, really want it and then end up eating too much. So it's like, yeah, enjoy life, but make sure that 80% of what you're doing is on track for longevity and health.
But I feel like that's what makes it sustainable, is because you do allow yourself to have that chocolate bar, that coffee, that whiskey, whatever it is. But then often that's not talked about in diets. When you look up online, this diet, no, 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 you must simply drink water and eat green food forever
Yeah.
and then you'll lose weight. But then suddenly, you know, if you make it even a week into that, you're doing well. But you're not in prison. Like you're
No.
wanting to live your life in a sustainable way for health. And if you then have that big relapse and think like, screw it, I'm going to go and buy every chocolate bar I see, that's so much worse than just having, you know, a chocolate bar a day, even if you need to do that.
Exactly. And part of it also is we have such a negative self-talk going on, especially, when we talk about how women, like how I was being blamed for being the odd one out. And when we were doing university stuff, it's just so endemic for women to have that negative self-talk where if I have that chocolate bar, it's going to ruin everything. So I better not have it. Or, oh gosh, I had that chocolate bar. I better go work out harder for the next 3 days just to counter it. It's like, no, give yourself permission. It is absolutely okay to enjoy life and have that. And, like for people who are training and under a tight schedule, and then all of a sudden it's school holidays and they're like, I can't train. It's like, well, actually, if we periodize and say these 2 weeks you have kids, let's just try to have maintenance where you do active stuff, but it's not necessarily prescriptive. It gives women permission to just be. And I think that's the thing that we don't do is we don't give women permission just to be human and to enjoy life and to try to fit things in, because there's that negative connotation that surround women that we have to be able to do everything all the time and be perfect. And then that feeds forward to that incredibly damaging negative self-talk.
And I think in the modern day, when women, they want to be healthy, they want to look good, they want to produce amazing food, have very healthy children, be active, have a social life, but also work, is quite a new, fairly new phenomenon, you know, since the last several decades, where it's become normalized for women to have a career, work throughout having children, which biologically is a massive stress on the body, like mentally as well. Like I can almost hear people breathing that sigh of relief when you're like, it's okay for women to feel like it's a lot to do and just try their best. They are human. And often we're not actually told that, which is just the
No.
most simple, comforting thing. It is okay. You are human. Eat the chocolate bar. You're not a failure.
Yeah, I had this conversation with my friend this evening. She's having, like, she's a doctor, she has 3 kids, her husband's a surgeon. And so she's like, I'm almost tapped out. And I saw her the other day and I was like, I get to a point where I like lock myself in the room and say, I'm not a good mom. I can't be mom right now. I need my own time. She said tonight that she tried that with her kids the other day and she felt amazing and her kids didn't freak out. They're like, oh, yeah, okay, mom needs her time. That's fine. It's like, that's probably the first time she's given herself permission just to be. And I'm like, why don't we tell more women that you are a person too? So you can take that time and take that space and be okay and give yourself permission just to do what you want to do or need to do to maintain your own mental and physical health.
Absolutely. The mental health is such a big aspect of that. Such a big aspect if you talk about weight loss as well. If you have a poor mental health, it's
Absolutely.
going to be so much more difficult to shift the weight, even if you're doing everything right, ticking every box. You're going to have that massive stress factor because stress is a huge thing. We touched on it slightly earlier, but it's a massive thing when it comes to female physiology and their general health, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I put sleep as the first big rock, because if we are able to get good sleep, it helps with mental health as well. And then it's that cascading event of, yes, I can handle the stress. Because if we have poor sleep and we have episodes of depression and anxiety, then any stress becomes too much. And this creates that downward spiral that so many women get into without the ability to ask for help or understand actually what's going on. Why am I in this depressive episode? Why am I so anxious? Why am I so sympathetically driven? And it's like, okay, we have to take that step back and say, these are the stress points. This is how we take care of those stress points. And this is how you take care of yourself.
Yeah, taking a step back to analyze is a very valuable tool. And also having a friend, like as you said there earlier, having a friend to say you're good, just go and take some you time is sometimes as
Yep.
simple as it needs to be, but having that conversation is so important. And then back to fueling as well, the hydration aspect. And I want to ask you, because I've read about it, but I just want to mention it in the podcast, is adding salt to your water so that it actually absorbs into your body. Can you just kind of talk through the science behind that? Because I find it so fascinating, to the point where I told my husband about this and he adds salt to every glass of water I have. And I'm like, okay, this is too much, too much.
Yeah, I mean, hydration's gotten such a weird, discombobbled kind of theme around it when we talk about sport hydration and what needs to be in a drink to hydrate us. And we need these electrolytes and that kind of stuff. But we look at basic physiology. There's no plain water in the body, and we have plenty of sodium stores. So we don't need to, quote, replace them with electrolyte tablets. So we look at the small intestines itself, where we have 95% of our water absorption. Basically, we need a solution of glucose and salt. And if you're drinking plain water, you don't have those two things in the plain water. So it kind of hangs out until your body goes, okay, I can either pull more salt and some glucose into the solution to be able to absorb it, or actually, no, I can't. So I'm going to pee it out. So if we add just a little bit of salt to the water, so it's 1/16 a teaspoon per 500 to 750 mil, so just a small dash. You can't taste it, but then it actually works in the small intestines to signal let's be absorbed, because your body can definitely give a little bit of glucose because it's hanging out in the small intestines anyway. So it's one of the small things that works amazingly, because you have people who are walking around with water bottles and drinking liters a day and peeing it out and still being thirsty. It's because they're not absorbing it. So if you have a little bit of salt in your water, you end up drinking less and becoming hydrated.
I'm just picturing when you say this, the massive bottles with like the handle that people have. I mean, I feel like the Stanley Cups are actually quite a style piece. I understand that part,
Yeah.
but the massive plastic ones that people
Yeah.
carry about. And also interesting, I'm not sure what you think about this, but having water bottles which are made from plastic, because then you have like the plastic. If you put this through the dishwasher, do you have a strong
Yep.
opinion on the plastic water bottle?
Well, I don't use plastic water bottles because I'm a little bit worried and suspect about the BPAs and stuff. Because we have enough environmental toxins. Now I really sound like the hippie child that grew up in San Francisco. But I'm very concerned because we live near a port and we get really bad allergies depending on what ships are in and all the stuff that's in the air. So it's like, okay, if the wind blowing off the port can cause some kind of reaction, then if I'm using something that is going to allow me to ingest something, I'm pretty sure it's not a good thing. So yeah, I'm like, let's see all of our reusable non-plastic water bottles.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just these things that you can do that are within your control, that you
Yeah.
can have that change. That's a small change. Just buy a metal or a glass water bottle, and it can make a
Hmm.
big difference. And it's just those little bits that you can put into your everyday routine as well. And another thing that people kind of view as health, and perhaps it's been a bit hyped up recently, is the cold water exposure and doing a bit of cold plunging, whether it's wild swimming or whether you're simply in like a tub outside your house. What are your thoughts on that for women specifically?
The current thing of an ice bath is too cold for women. So when we're looking at a cold water plunge and we want to get the immune responses and the parasympathetic responses, for women, you get that around 14 degrees C water. When you start getting into the ice, it's too cold and you have a kind of a negative response. It's too severe of constriction and your body gets into too much of a shiver response. And because it's so cold, you can't get the adaptive change that we see with men over 3 or 4 exposures, because women's responses to stress are different, especially environmental stressors. So I'm a big advocate for heat. We see almost everyone, men and women, respond to heat and get better cardiovascular and immune responses. For cold, men are okay for the really cold ice, but for women to get benefit, it has to be a little bit warmer. So 14 degrees C is not warm, but it's not the severe cold that doesn't give you the responses.
And what are the benefits of cold water exposure, do you think, in your everyday life? Do you do it yourself?
Um, I live by a very cold ocean and I can put my foot in, but I'm not very good at the cold. So
I
no,
don't
I
like it
don't.
either. I really don't like it. But I'm like, is
None.
it worth it? Is it worth the pain?
So I have a sauna because I'm a thermoreg environmental exercise physiologist at the start. And I've looked at all the great things that heat can do. And it feels good, especially in winter. You are lucky enough to be going into, although it is a European summer, I'm not sure how warm it is in the mountains in the UK, but down here, winter is pretty cold. So getting in a sauna to warm up, but also to get things like an increase in heat shock protein and cardiovascular benefits and the parasympathetic activation that you get from heat exposure. Because, you get in the sauna, you get really hot. And then a few hours later, you're really tired. And it's a good tired. It's not a pain tired. That's a parasympathetic response. So with cold exposure, you'll get a metabolic and an endocrine response. So it's such a shock to the system that the cells really use glucose rapidly. So your body has to learn how to mitigate that. So you get a little bit better glucose control. You also get that in the heat. When we see the parasympathetic drive and the endocrine responses, it comes from um, some of the endorphins that are released in response to the cold shock to make you not feel miserable. Like it's kind of a protective response. In the heat, you don't get as strong of that endorphin response, but that's okay because you get a different pathway to parasympathetic activation. So if you don't like the cold, you don't have to go in it. You can get benefit from heat exposure. But if you really do like the cold and you like the way it makes you feel, and you're a woman, just go into that 14-degree, not into the ice, to really find a benefit and still get all of the things that you hear about cold plunge, but a better benefit for your body as a female.
Because a lot of people say women who are very cold, which I can be quite cold and I have bad circulation in my hands. So they're like, oh, go straight into cold water and then your body will regulate more and you'll be more used to that. But I'm like, my hands might fall off and I will not enjoy
Mm-hmm.
this at all. So do you think that's actually not quite the right way to go about it?
Yeah, because when we talk about Raynaud's, so when you get really, really severe constriction and which is a sex difference, a lot of women get it and it becomes more prevalent as you get older and has to do with estrogen exposure and regulation. If you have Raynaud's, it can get worse when you get cold exposure. And so sitting in an ice bath, if you're predisposed to Raynaud's, is going to cause that severe constriction that can be very dangerous. So the idea of getting in and having that exposure is counterintuitive. So if you are someone who has that severe constrictive response in the peripheral and has that predisposition to Raynaud's or has full Raynaud's, it's not a good idea to get into that cold. So you'll have that severe constriction, but then you get that nerve burning feeling that can last for up to 24 hours after that really cold exposure.
Wow, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think a lot of things on social media, which is where a lot of people get a lot of their research from, and they won't even know that they're kind of taking it in and suddenly they have all of these thoughts that they're like, where did this come from? And they're from people who they don't, they're not qualified. They don't necessarily, you don't know what research these PTs have. They might have done an online course. They might be the best PT ever. You don't know the difference if you're just interacting with how good their Instagram reel is. But how do you feel as someone who is immensely qualified in your field about the rise of social media, the rise of all these fitness gurus, and then people are adapting very much to what these people are saying, which even if you look into the studies of the female fitness industry, you're saying, there's not even research really done in a lot of the areas of it. So you really need to search it out. Never mind if you're just using social media or like male PTs when you're a female, like to have your kind of point of reference.
I find it very frustrating for sure. And like one of my points and some of my other colleagues that we don't take money for social media, but you have a lot of influencers who make their money on social media. So they're pushing out products, they're pushing out information. And the general consumer doesn't know the difference, right? So I can be compared to a social media influencer who's making $1 million a month because of something that they're saying in a product that they're throwing. So in that regard, it's really frustrating to try to educate and to get the right messaging across. And in a backlash to that, there is a cohort of us that are putting together like different social media campaigns and collaborating for public awareness on different things. So I'm starting to see more of the people who are on there from the science perspective pushing back and saying, if you want to, then you go to these people who have the right information. And then there's like 6 people who are all doing the same kind of social media campaign on like pelvic floor health or menopause hormone therapy. So we're trying to get a whole bunch of people to band together to put the same information out through different channels to try to get above that whole influencer versus real science thing that's out there.
It's all about where you get your information from and being aware of it as well. Just check, like, even don't just watch the reel, look on someone's profile, look at, you know, what, if they've got a website or what they're giving out, and that just verify the information that you're consuming, because a lot of the time we don't even realize that. And if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, right, there's one thing that you want them to take away from this podcast episode, what would it be?
I think the one thing that I want people to understand is they want to empower themselves, right? So if you see something that's trendy and it's on across all the social media channels, right? I want you to take that 6-second pause and say, where did this study originate from? Did it originate from a clinical population that was sick and obese and then brought over to the fitness? Or did it originate really in this athletic fitness population? And is it appropriate for me as a woman or me as a man and where I am in my life? Like, you really want to understand, because we're so bombarded with information. Like, just try to empower yourself for that knowledge. Yeah, it's hard. But if you go to PubMed and you put in a search, everyone can access PubMed and get the right kind of information just to see, is it really been done and what population was it done on? You don't have to understand the abstract. You don't have to understand all the discussion and the methods, but just really see, is that population specific to who I am and what my needs are at this point in time?
And I think you just mentioned there, what stage are you in your life? And do you think that people need to adapt their routine significantly throughout their life? Women have the 20s, 30s, perimenopausal, menopause, you know, all of these different stages. Is it important to evaluate it at these marks in
Yeah.
life?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're not a linear algorithm and our body changes just as our hormone profile changes. You see someone who is going through puberty is completely different from being in their late 20s, who again is different than in their late 30s. So women, we don't age in a linear fashion like men. Like, we start to see information about men and low testosterone when they hit their mid 60s, but we start to see aging issues with women in their mid 30s, and people aren't aware that, yes, if I'm having a change in my hormone ratios, or I've changed from an oral contraceptive pill to an IUD, all of these hormonal influences change the way that our body responds to stress, including exercise and the way that we use nutrition to support ourselves. So when you're thinking about where am I in my life phase, you really need to say, okay, well, yeah, where am I? Is this appropriate? And am I in my 30s? And am I in my early 30s or my late 30s? Am I starting to get to perimenopause? Because people don't understand that. And it's like, yeah, things that are you used to do when you're in your 20s, you can't get away with in your 30s. And it's not necessarily because of discontinuation of muscle quality, but it's because you're having hormonal changes that directly affect how your body responds.
And if people want to learn more about this, what are some really good resources that you would suggest to tap into? As well, of course, you have your Instagram profile, you have your books, which I'll link in the description below so people can access that. But where should people go to get this reliable information?
Gabrielle Lyon, she's really good, especially when we're looking at the aging factor and muscle quality. So she's a doctor. She has lots of really cool things on her Instagram account as well. Abby Smith Ryan, I mentioned earlier, from University of North Carolina. She and her research team, very, very focused on women across the lifespan with regards to exercise and supplements. So she isn't that prolific on Instagram and social media, but her lab is very good. And you can go to UNC and look her up and find all of her research. And then various organizations like the WUSI group that has Harvard and Stanford and some places from the UK and Australia. So it's a big collaborative group of people who are trying to get really good research on women across the the lifespan, and then the Stanford Lifestyle Medicine Group. So those would be the big ones that I would say you can count on the information being scientifically backed, evidence-based, and really good at disseminating the right information.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stacey, for coming on and talking to me all about this. I feel like I said to you before we recorded, it's a personal privilege to be able to ask you these questions. But I think that so many people who are listening to this, who are trying to understand the world of fitness, what is working, why is something not working, and to just have this information to tap into about females specifically, to understand our bodies more, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, is something that is just so valuable, and that I just really would urge people to learn more about and read your books. As I said before, check out what you're sharing and these amazing resources that you've given. So thank you so much for your time today.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.